Digital art can be quite overwhelming at first because there are so many tools, techniques and styles. If you are painting digitally, you can and will learn something new every single day. Often you will discover new and easier ways of doing things you've learned before, and sometimes you'll find a brush or a tool that simply inspires you. Today I bring you 5 tips and techniques to improve your digital art that you may have never seen before and hopefully inspire you to try them yourself. I think no matter what your art style is, there'll be something in them that you can integrate into your workflow. Some of the tips in this video will work in any art program, and some are more focused on Clipstudio specifically, which has become my go-to app for digital art. And I want to thank Celsius, the makers of Clipstudio, for sponsoring this video. Clipstudio comes with tons of features, an integrated time-lapse, and you can get an endless amount of assets like brushes, models and more made by the huge Clipstudio community. So if you ever happen to wonder what app I use in my videos, it's typically Clipstudio Paint. Let's start, shall we? Tip number 1. Painting with the smudge tool family. When you think of painting digitally, normally you would pick a color, pick a brush and just go for it. With a bit of experience, you might already know how to include the color pick tool to blend the tones. But here is another tool that has become a staple for my painting process, and that is the finger smudge tool. Clipstudio comes with a variety of smudging tools, so I want to dive a bit deeper into the functions and use cases for some of them. The blur tool. The blur tool is the compact interactive version of the Gaussian blur filter. Every edge you touch with it gets softer, which makes it an essential tool to create clean and smooth gradients. And in the context of a painting, it can be incredibly helpful. Often you can find unwanted textures, maybe from the brushes used or the sketch which is on the same layer. Using an airbrush, it can be quite difficult to pick up the right tones to overpaint those spots without ruining the rest. With the blur tool that gets a lot simpler, as we don't have to find the transition tones, but instead we can make use of the already applied color. In my painting process, I like to work with rougher brush strokes in the beginning, so it's easier to pin down the proportions of the character's features without getting lost in details. With the blur tool, I can then quickly incorporate the shadows directly. The combination of harder and softer edges already helps to convey a bit of depth. The blur tool also helps to incorporate lines into the painting. With a semi-realistic style, line art often tends to stick out a bit, making the painting look a bit more cartoonish, or in worst cases, the depicted subject looks like it was slapped on. For example, lips with a sharp outline don't really look like they belong to the face, but with a bit of blur, they are far more convincing. The size of the brush and pressure play a huge role when it comes to using this tool, so you want to make sure to adjust it to your needs. For larger areas, you typically want to have a bigger brush, and for little details, a smaller brush fits better. The pressure you apply gives you a bit of room to play with. For example, using a larger brush with little pressure still lets you blur details pretty precisely. The fingertip tool. The fingertip tool has grown to be one of my all-time favorite tools of the last years. It is of massive help when painting, because unlike the blur tool, it can also create hard edges, making it an extremely powerful addition to your regular brush set. By the way, closely related to the fingertip tool is the thumbs up button, the one that isn't in your art application but underneath the video. While the blur tool really makes it easy to create smooth and soft surfaces, it also tends to blur details into nothingness pretty quickly, which makes it useful only to a certain degree. For the rest, there is our little finger boy here. Using the fingertip, I can not only keep these details, but actually create them. And the secret to make the most out of this tool is the size. With a small size, you can drag the color basically anywhere, creating subtle little lines. The smaller the brush, the harder the created edge. As you use the color on the canvas, the lines already look organically incorporated. Let's compare how I add the highlights here using a brush, with doing the same thing with the fingertip. The brush stroke remains visible as a brush stroke, while the fingertip tool makes it almost look like something from a 3D program. And we can use that effect, for example when painting eyelids, lashes or nostrils. Basically anytime we want to smoothen features but also keep the details. For shading, it can also become incredibly helpful to drag the colors across the nose or the neck to build a base. Any off-putting irregularities then can be smoothed out with the blur tool. The way the drag color fades out kind of reminds me of using the soft brush tip of markers. Only here you can use any color and adjust the strength. For details across the face, I like to use a strength around 60 to 70%. For hair on the other hand, I go for higher strength, so I can paint longer strands of hair. Now, using the fingertip tool for painting like that can quickly result in the aesthetic of old school digital art, if you go overboard with it. That's where the larger sizes come into play. Setting the tool to a larger size, we basically have a different tool in our hands. With little pressure applied and tiny zigzag motions, it can almost act like the blur tool and enables us to smudge larger chunks of the painting. But not quite. The fingertip doesn't blur the colors, it drags them, which means we can be more precise and keep the hard edges where we need them. This helps with the shadows around the eyes, for example, but can also add much needed variation when coloring hair. You can also use it to incorporate textures like freckles. Simply use it on top of the texture and lightly move your pen to randomly soften the hard edges. I normally recommend having the opacity set to 100%, unless you have a reason not to. Using this tool with lower opacity often leads to slightly weird looking results. The smudge tool. This tool I don't use as often. It's what would happen if the blur and fingertip tool had a baby, enabling you to drag color while simultaneously applying a blur. I think it's great for creating larger gradients, as it drags and mixes the color together along the stroke of your pen. For delicate paintings though, it might be a bit overkill, so I recommend using it sparingly or maybe just for backgrounds. Tip number 2. Use liquify to your advantage. Another trick I want to talk about includes the liquify tool. The liquify tool is another game changer of digital art, where I really wish there was an equivalent tool for traditional art. The major advantage of using the liquify tool is that you can change proportions of your drawing in a single hand gesture without the need to draw it all over again. One eye is too high? Just push it down. Cheeks are too wide? Simply pinch them in place. There are different options to this tool that you can find down here. You have the classic push setting, which lets you drag things across the screen in any direction similar to the fingertip tool, but with less loss of information. It's helpful when you want to change the length of body parts, their position, their shape, whatever you have. Then there's expand. That works like a fisheye filter. This brush always reminds me of an air pump, as it is probably the go-to tool whenever you need to paint balloons. It inflates the area it is used on, adding volume. In smaller doses, it can be used to change the eye size, nose size, lip size, and so on. But of course it also works on larger parts, in case you want to inflate the head, chest, or single fingers. It also works to add more volume to hair, so when your line work looks a bit flat, make sure to give this one a try. Pinch, on the other hand, deflates the area it's used on. Like a beauty filter, you can use it to make the nose smaller. Or the eyes, in case you have an internalized manga art style, like I do, that makes you always end up drawing them too big. I often tend to draw the faces a bit too round, so it helps with that as well. And of course you can use it to make the arms thinner, or the fingers, or whatever else you have in mind. For the hair, it makes sense to use it on the outside fringes, to contract and gather more detail at these areas, and therefore make the hair look more three-dimensional. Another option is the twirl clockwise counterclockwise setting. Typically I use these for the eyes. Depending on the perspective of your character, the line you place the eyes on is either a concave or convex curve. The twirl tool is a great way to make the eyes match that line, as it rotates the eye corner while leaving the pupil area mostly unharmed. But with liquify, size also matters. It might sound obvious, but a smaller setting only affects a small area. What does that mean for our drawing? Using a small brush might not always work as intended. If we want to tweeze the size of a cheek, for example, a small size can result in creating these little bumps. But a larger brush can move things we actually don't want to push away. This is why I use a little workaround. When it comes to situations like this, I like to use clipping masks. I duplicate the layer, put the copy on top, and make it a clipping mask. Now I am able to change the shape of the face by using the liquify tool on the base layer. This gives me the option to have the drawing itself unchanged and only manipulate the shape it is clipped to. Of course, we can also make use of the reverse, leaving the shape unharmed, but changing the drawing that was clipped on it. I love to use this method for the hair, when I want to add more volume but not change the overall shape. because typically when you use liquify on the hair to adjust the proportions, it's nearly impossible to not also affect areas that look fine. So, like before, I copied the hair layer and clip it. Now I use the liquify tool to warp the clip layer. The shape stays the same, but I'm able to change the inside, giving it more volume, or change the point of growth. Of course, both ways will need some fixing afterwards, as the lines won't align at the fringes of the shape, but it's a really safe way to use this tool, as with using a copy you always have the original to fall back on. Tip number 3, make your shading pop the easy way. Using layers set to multiply is a pretty common method among cel shading anime artists in my experience. At least it was the first technique I learned about when I read tutorials on manga websites back in 2007, when I took my first steps with digital art. At the time, you would usually just create a new layer on top of the base color layer and start using a somewhat neutral gray color to paint in the shadows. Maybe using a hard brush like the G-Pen, or even creating the shadows with the lasso tool. Occasionally, you would use a big airbrush for rough gradients and color shifts. This makes coloring multiply layers a staple for cel shading styles, as you don't have to pick a new shade for every detail, but basically one tone that fits all. But with a little twist to this method, they are not only useful for anime art styles, but they can add depth to any type of drawing or painting. For that I create a new layer and fill it with a gradient. The colors I choose for the gradients typically range from subtle warm grays to colder, more desaturated violet tones. I spread the gradient across the whole subject that I want to cover, so I can make the layer a clipping mask. If you want to cover multiple layers but are not interested in merging them, you can put these layers into a folder and clip the gradient layer to that folder. Now I set the layer to multiply, filling my character with the dark grays. Then I create a layer mask for that layer. With that layer mask I'm able to erase holes into the gradient without actually deleting any information on that layer. The erased spots appear lighter and I can start adding highlights or enhancing existing ones. The multiply layer at this point can serve as a map for lighting. You can play around and try any kind of light situation. What would the character look like if the light came from the side or from below? With the layer mask you always have a chance of removing the light again and putting it somewhere else. To add a more dramatic look to the highlights, I like to work with subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is that effect where light that enters a translucent object is scattered by interacting with the material and then exits at a different point. And yes, I totally didn't just read the Wikipedia for that. While the effect is based in science, for our purpose it is enough to see the subsurface scattering as just an excuse to add saturated colors to our artwork in an eye-pleasing manner. For that I pick a saturated orange tone. You can of course also work with blue or whatever you like. Then I paint on the gradient, not the layer mask, and trace my highlights. I pay attention to using a hard brush for the hard edges and I get blurry around the soft transitions, either by blurring the brush strokes or directly using an airbrush for that. Same goes of course for all the other highlights. The saturated tones really add a bit of spice to the drawing, which is why I love to use it with almost all of my drawings regardless of style. If you think the multiply layer makes your drawing too dark, you can of course adjust the opacity. And if you want to make the highlights pop even more, there is an easy way. Now that we have drawn the map of highlights, all we have to do is create a selection of the layer mask. Then we invert that selection and fill it with the light tone on a new layer inside the folder. It can be white or just the lightest tone you have used for the skin so far. In any case, playing around with the opacity of that layer is a good way to adjust the intensity of the highlights. Tip number 4. Create depth with overlapping. Next I want to show you an easy trick for how you can add depth to your painting. With the character done and only a gradient in the background, most images look a bit flat. What is missing is an easily readable fore and background. When it comes to creating an illusion of spatiality, overlapping is an effective method. And to make that happen, we want to create something that we can put in front and behind our character. Basically anything can do the trick. From other characters to plants or whatever fits the scene. If I don't have any specific idea, there is at least one thing I can use, and that is smoke. It's easy to bring into shape in case you are hesitant to cover areas that you want to show off, and it also adds a pretty neutral atmosphere. You can go for a simple cloudy brush, for example. There are plenty in the Clipstudio asset section, but there's also a more graphic version that you can try. For that I used the lasso tool and I built my selection step by step. On the areas I plan to cover, I draw arcs with swift hand motions. If you are not entirely sure what you are doing, that actually is not a bad thing, as it adds to the randomness of the clouds we are going to paint. Just don't be too tense and you end up with clean and dynamic curves. Then I shift between those little plus and minus signs, so I can add more curvy shapes to that selection or delete anything unwanted. I execute these with the same hand motion, varying the size of the selection. This way I end up with a bunch of different shapes, some thicker, some thinner, and some are even just lines, echoing the shape of the clouds. With the use of these swift hand gestures though, the result will look dynamic almost automatically. Then I fill the selection with a flat color, typically a lighter one, on a new layer. If you see any irregularities or bumps, you can use a hard brush like the G-Pen and switch between the color and eraser option to fix any of the distractions. The brush is also really helpful with smaller details, like singular lines, or to make the shapes parallel to each other. If you end up not liking the position of the clouds, either because they ended up covering anything unwanted or simply because they still look a bit stiff, our old friend Liquify is here to help. On the largest setting I can push these clouds around to make them even more dynamic, or as I mentioned, I can also inflate them or make them slimmer with the right setting of the tool. Then I add some shading. I lock the layer and with a paintbrush and a slightly darker tone I paint the shadows. Typically I go for a stroke that follows the shape of the cloud and then I pick a lighter color again to fill these shadows with a bit of highlight to make them look less plain and more interesting. With that done, I use the fingertip tool to make these clouds more streamlined. Since the fingertip tool drags the color along with the stroke, using it adds a bit of blur to the clouds. With the tool equipped, I follow their directions and in doing so I create variations of soft and hard edges. That helps merge them more with the background and also adds a bit of movement to them, like if the smoke was just emerging out of the atmosphere or gets blown across the painting. With the motion blur filter I can increase that effect. You can find the filter in the top menu under Filter, Blur, Motion Blur. And this is how we end up with beautifully dynamic clouds, or smoke, whatever you like to call it. With only a few adjustments we can turn these into magical light effects. The process is the same for the most parts. Use the lasso tool to create the shape you need and refine it when necessary with the G-Pen, liquify and fingertip tool, so you end up with nice looking flat smoke. Now create a new layer and clip it on the smoke layer. With the colorful gradient I fill the clipping mask. Now the smoke has been colored by the gradient. Next I'll use a correction layer. Click on Layer, New Correction Layer and Tone Curves to create a tone curve layer. See that little box that says RGB? Click it and choose R and then randomly manipulate the curve. Clip this one on top of the gradient and smoke layer, so it only affects our defined shapes. When you double click the correction layer, it opens the tone curves again and we can begin playing around with them. Repeat this for G and B as well, and you should end up with a pretty psychedelic looking color palette. Now back to the gradient layer. Get your fingertip tool and start dragging the colors along the shapes. The tone curve layer not only adds randomized colors to the mix, but also makes the transitions between the colors appear harder and softer, depending on how it is set up. And as we randomly change the curve, it creates some interesting effects. Once we are done with dragging the colors along, we can change the colors to fit more with the already existing palette of our painting, using the hue saturation filter and level correction. Tip number 5, try out some new brushes. The last tip is a bit different. It's something I figured out recently and thought looks cool, so I wanted to include it in this video. It's a brush that already comes with Clipstudio and can be used to create watercolor effects and textures. Usually I'm quite skeptical of digital brushes which try to emulate traditional tools that I'm very familiar with. They might be good brushes in their own regards, but when compared to their analog counterparts they often fall a bit flat. Oil brushes can pull it off sometimes, but it's exceptionally rare to find something that can be used to create a convincing watercolor effect. Which is why I was all the more surprised to find a few great watercolor brushes with the default collection of brushes in the latest version of Clipstudio. The first brush is called Wet Wash and you can find it in the watercolor folder under Brush Tool. The way this brush works is quite intuitive. You choose a light color and then, with light pressure, you can start painting. As long as the pen stays on the tablet, you have the chance to wash the applied color away again. So if you start with a dark spot, for example, and rotate your pen on the canvas, the color gets lighter with every motion, resulting in these watercolor-like edges on the outer fringes. Once the pressure you apply exceeds a certain threshold, the color stays where it is. The texture of the brush reminds me a bit of the granulating properties some watercolors have. But if you don't like it, you can change it to a whole bunch of other available textures. So let's paint some flowers with a wet wash brush. I create a new transparent layer and start by roughly painting the first petal using a light pinkish magenta color. I only use a little pressure, so the inside of the petal stays lighter than the outline. I don't need it to be very neat and tidy, as for one, I want to emulate that loose carefree style that's so typical for watercolors, and also because I can adjust anything shape-wise with the liquify tool later. One by one I add the petals. Next are the shadows. I'll pick a darker, less vibrant violet and layer the color on the petals. Again, it doesn't need to be too tidy or detailed. Luckily so, because that would actually be quite difficult with the brush size I'm using. If things turn too dark, you can use the watery brush from the set to erase some of the color. Then I add another wash of the pinkish tone on top. Because the brushes are automatically set to multiply, they only work from light to dark. That means the shadows only get darker, even if I choose a lighter color to overpaint them with, which kind of represents how you'd work with actual watercolors in a pretty accurate way. That is the light to dark aspect of it. If we were to use the brush on a dark canvas, they would look off, almost like chalk. The other brush I want to focus on is called wet blotting ink and can be found under brush tool and then India ink. This one is quite similar to the wet wash brush, but it feels a lot wetter. With it I add the dark yellow color to the center of the flower, using the brush with very light pressure to have the color run across the petals and thus creating even more watercolor edges that look like the colors have bled into each other. I use the brush almost like a stamp to paint some more details inside the flower. With the wet blotting ink brush set to eraser mode, I can lift off some color, making parts of the flower lighter than others and adding more of that washed out texture. Lastly, with the help of liquify, I bring everything into the right shape, pushing and pinching the petals until they look nice and more natural. To make them look even more convincing, we can add a nice dripping effect. Pick the ruler tool, choose special ruler and then parallel line. Then create a vertical line with it on a new layer. Now the ruler is set up and we can use the wet wash brush again to draw straight lines dripping down from the flowers. With a bit more pen pressure towards the end of the line, we can add this drop effect, where in real life the watercolor would gather due to gravity. And that is how you can use these brushes to draw watercolor flowers in Clipstudio. There are of course endless more ways and even more brushes that you can go for. Because I used Clipstudio set to German, I had to research the English names for all the brushes. And while doing that, I came across some other free brush sets from the asset section that I'll link down below. So to summarize this tip, be open to try new things. As I said, usually I dislike these kinds of brushes, but playing around a bit out of curiosity, it actually impressed and inspired me. Anyway, that's it. If you happen to know more tips or want me to cover specific techniques, let me know in the comments. And check out my other videos on digital art, especially the tutorials, to learn more techniques and get inspired. Also follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more regular art. Thanks so much for watching and until next time.